It gives me great pleasure to welcome you all to the first of this year's Humanitas Interfaith Lectures. Humanitas is a series of visiting professorships at Oxford and Cambridge intended to bring leading practitioners and scholars to both universities to address major themes in the arts, social sciences and humanities. Created by Lord Weidenfeld, the program is managed and funded by the Institute for Strategic Dialogue with the support of a series of generous benefactors in collaboration with the Humanities Division of the University of Oxford. The Humanitas Chair in Interfaith Studies has been made possible by the generous support of both Mr. Xavier Garand-Hermes in the name of the Garand-Hermes Foundation for Peace and of Mr. Gil Shiva in the name of the Susan Stein Shiva Foundation. Now, it is of course a cliche to say that a speaker does need no introduction, but if this cliche is ever true, then it must be true of today's speaker, Rowan Williams, Dr. Rowan Williams, or as we should now probably say, Lord Williams. We're all very, very pleased, Rowan, to have you here and speak to us today. Of course, you all know that before he became Master of Magdalen College, Cambridge in 2012, he was, for 10 years, Archbishop of Canterbury. Perhaps not everybody knows, though, that at some point he was also the Lady Margaret Professor of Divinity here in the University of Oxford, and so coming to Oxford, I hope, is also a little bit like coming home. But Rowan Williams, or the fact that he was bishop as well as a professor, already shows that he is really both. He is a leading teacher and a leading, well, as the introduction to the lectureship says, practitioner, a leader of Christianity, of Anglican Christianity, of course, in particular. He is a scholar of patristic theology, and he is generally recognized as one of the leading original theological thinkers of our time. For all these reasons, there will be few, if any, other people who are as competent to speak on the topic of faith and power, which Rowan Williams has chosen as his topic for his lectures. And it therefore gives me great pleasure now to announce the title of his first lecture and then hand over to the man whom to hear you've all come. So the title is Faith, Force and Authority. Does religious belief change our understanding of how power works in society? Rowan, we very much look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you very much for your welcome, and thank you for the invitation to hold this professorship and to deliver these reflections today and next week. What I want to do this afternoon is to reflect very generally on what I believe to be a basic paradox in many religious attitudes to power. And this will take us to some quite fundamental reflections on the kind of God to whom power is ascribed, especially in the Abrahamic religions, the kind of use and abuse that is made of power in religious institutions and religious rhetoric, and I hope may open up some channels for thinking again about what non-violent human relations might actually look like. And on the basis of that, I hope next week to move on to talk a little more about power as it affects and is experienced in human maturing. And as I've hinted, there is a fundamental paradox in the way we talk about power. Most religious traditions claim that they are, in some sense, in contact with an ultimate and unlimited power, in touch with the unlimited power which creates the world. And you don't get much more unlimited than that. A power that makes something to be and sustains something in being. Now, if that claim is taken seriously, it ought to be the case that believers were basically confident. That's to say, they would be confident about the long-term future of the universe. Confident that their own standing or security didn't depend on what they did or what they achieved. Confident, in fact, that their own exercise of power or domination was not going to be the decisive factor in their life or the life of their environment. And yet, historically, religious faith becomes involved again and again in projects of comprehensive control and deep-rooted anxiety. As if the fundamental characteristic of religion was that it produced human beings who could not bear to be powerless and who were constantly seeking to shore up the power or control that they possessed, because the universe and they themselves would disappear without it. Religion becomes involved in projects of control, seeking to safeguard God's will or purpose, and to restrain or suppress anything that might count as rebellion against God. And so, religion comes to be perceived, unsurprisingly, as an essentially repressive force in culture. If you ask many people what they most readily associate with religious practice and rhetoric, the sad truth is that in our world it would very often be an obsession about control and a deep-rooted anxiety about losing control. So that's the paradox from which I begin. And what I want to do this afternoon is to try to unravel its terms a little bit, to show, as best I can, how some of that contradiction arises, and to see if we can move forward from it. And perhaps the first point to make here is that the logic of an idea like unlimited power is in fact a good deal more complex than we might suspect, especially as it's used in some kinds of rather more self-aware religious discourse. It's more complex than many of its defenders and many of its critics might realize. The notion of unlimited divine power evolves in concert with a whole cluster of things that you say about the divine. That the divine is, for example, beyond change, or controversially, beyond suffering. That the divine is not a subject within time, that sort of thing. Unlimited power belongs with that category of basically negative ascriptions to God, denying that limitations of the kind that apply to you and me apply when we're talking about the divine. It's all part of a sustained campaign, you might say, to make it clear that God is not an agent alongside other agents inside the universe. The notion of unlimited power is about that campaign to make it clear that God is not an agent among other agents inside the universe. It's characteristic of agents inside the universe that they encounter constraints in their liberty to do what they want to do. And it's typical of agents inside the universe that they attain what they want through discovering and negotiating and managing the constraints that they encounter, the limits of their power to act. And the classical religious traditions have, on the whole, said that whatever we might say about the action of God, this kind of language can't really apply to it. God doesn't negotiate with other agents in order to achieve his goals. God doesn't discover what he can do by trial and error. God, therefore, doesn't feel anxious about what he can do. God doesn't experience the setbacks that we might experience in achieving our goals. And perhaps most importantly of all, God's will is naturally productive. That's to say, what God wills is what is. Or we could say, if we want to go back to the classical medieval language, that his being, his willing, and his doing are all simultaneous and can't be understood without each other. In the technical language of scholastic philosophy, God is simple. Now, so far so good, we may say. But the problem with that is how very readily we filter it through the medium of our own self-awareness. We think what it would be like for us to have no obstacle to our action, what it would be like for us to be able to do whatever we want. We think, therefore, that divine power must be an enormously magnified version of our capacity to get our own way, without quite noticing that getting our own way already presupposes there are other ways which must not be got. Our apprehension of power, in that sense, is very deeply, painfully competitive, rivalrous. And one of the things we are asked to discover about the language of divine power is that it has nothing to do with rivalry. From the very beginnings of systematic thinking about the divine, as far back as Plato at least, we find the statement that the divine nature is alien to envy. That is, to think about God in terms of a God who is in competition with other agents is a radical logical mistake. But it's a mistake that we're very ready to make. Now, religious devotion is an attitude of passionate attention to or adoration of that sort of life or power or action in which life and power and action are undivided. Religious devotion is the gazing upon that fullness of being which is what it is, does what it does, and is what it does, and wants what it is, all in a great sort of interlocking pattern. And of its very nature, that is a kind of power that we can't have and can't even dream of having, because that's a kind of being we can't have or be or dream of having. We are not like that. And perhaps that's why when we try to think about divine power in this context, we are so prone to project upon it that vastly inflated version I've already referred to of what it might be like for us to have no obstacles to getting our way, what it might be like for us to have no effective competitors and always to come out on top. Bad or corrupt religion is especially prone to doing this, as if by scaling down the mysteriousness of what has to be said about divine power, we could turn it into the kind of power we could imagine for ourselves. We take our gaze away from the integrity of that willing and doing and being that is God. We cease to contemplate, you might say, and so separate out the elements of what we say about God into those manageable, bite-sized proportions which make God appear a magnified version of myself. We turn it into the kind of power we can imagine having, which in effect turns God into an individual who is lucky enough to be able to get his way all the time. And we can more easily persuade ourselves to believe that if we keep God happy, perhaps he will let us have our way most of the time as well. But because in this picture God needs to be kept happy, we're always going to be anxious about whether we're doing enough of that. And a God who is both immeasurably powerful in this unconverted sense and also needs to be kept happy is a very uncomfortable partner in prayer or indeed in human living. And the effects of trying to live with a partner so imagined are as toxic as you might imagine. And one of the end points of this distorted frame of reference is that curious inversion of faith, which imagines that God needs us to protect him, and that God's interests are only safe in our hands, and that therefore we have to take responsibility for exercising the uncriticized, unqualified power which we ascribe to God here and now. Because, mysteriously, the all-powerful God can't be trusted to do this for himself and needs to be protected from the consequences of his own recklessness. But of course, one of the central affirmations of the philosophical theology of the Abrahamic faiths, and indeed of other philosophical theologies in somewhat different idioms, is that God is not only eternal freedom, but eternal bliss. Nothing can alter the kind of life that God lives in that sense. Or in plain English, the last thing God needs is people to keep him happy. God is what he is what he does, wills what he is, and loves what he wills. Here's the significant point. A God so imagined, or not imagined, of course, because we can't image this fully for ourselves, a God so imagined does not need us to make him safe, and a belief in divine power is a belief in a God whose life is not damaged by our failure. To believe, therefore, in divine power in that way is one step along the road to believing in a divine power which absolves or releases. That is, which makes our failure not the last word. The more clearly and robustly we believe in divine freedom or power or bliss or whatever, the less anxiety we should have about pleasing God. The pressure or imperative that believers feel to align their lives with God does not arise or should not arise from a fear of upsetting God or imperiling the balance of the universe. It should be that kind of pressure or imperative which comes from recognizing that this divine life is the only possible source for our own bliss or reconciliation or release or absolution, our own coming to be at home with ourselves and our world. So, to frame the rest of what I have to say, I've sketched here a very elementary version of what I believe to be the core convictions of a philosophical theology common to the Abrahamic faiths and with more in common than you might think with non-Abrahamic faiths, which looks towards a God in whom, as I've said, being, willing, and doing are the same. Anything we say about divine power belongs in the context of that primitive recognition. And so, moving on, if we respond to religious or secular anxiety with a more intense struggle for power in human terms, then we have mistaken the character of God, the power of God, and our own nature as creatures. In the Gospel according to St. John, Jesus responds to his questioning by Pilate with the words, "If my kingdom were of this world, then would my servants fight," which is about as concise and elegant a formulation of the point as we could wish. If the power which is in discussion here, in and around the person of Jesus, belongs to the order of competitive power exercised within the framework of this universe, then it would make sense for competitors on behalf of Jesus to fight their rivals. But it isn't and it doesn't. In the Christian tradition, especially in some passages of St. Augustine, perhaps rather surprisingly, the logic of an ethic of force or violence is that the more a cause is bound up with what we say is God's will and God's justice, the less justified is any violent defense of it. That is, as Augustine argues in The City of God, if we say that what we want to defend is truly the will and purpose of God, the less case there is for attempting to protect it at all costs or by all means available. If we're serious in saying this is of God, then the one thing that is not appropriate to its defense or its propagation is the force that belongs to ordinary earthly power. You could say in rather provocative terms that force is only defensible when it's not trying to enforce the will of God, but only to enforce pragmatic stability. And in passages of the City of God, that seems to be what Augustine is saying. The paradox here is that if there is such a thing as a just war, a question to which Augustine's answer is a bit more nuanced than some people think. If there is to be such a thing as a just war, it needs to be a very, very prosaic affair. It needs simply to be, as it were, fighting off the raiders on the borders. What it must not be is a crusade. Augustine gives the most sophisticated and detailed and, I would say, virtually unanswerable theological case against crusading that Christian theology has ever seen. He slightly spoils it by undermining his own argument in other places, but that's another story, and it's something Christian theologians do. And I'm probably in process of doing it this afternoon. But in the Augustinian world, the point is, you go to jail for crimes, not for sins. You go to war to defend food supplies for your population, not to defeat heresy. And whatever may be made of this strand in Christian teaching that seeks for a justification of force or violence, it does reflect a recognition that there shouldn't be an alliance between what are understood to be religious causes and concerns and the use of human force. Augustine, at least in his early years as a theologian, was very clear that faith could not be compelled. And even in his later years, when he was writing defences of the use of state power to suppress heresy, he still, of course, recognised that the one thing you could not compel was assent, foreshadowing the words that you read in a well-known passage of the Quran, that there is no compulsion in matters of faith. Now, this points us beyond the immediate issue to a deeper consideration of what it might then be for a believer to invoke or seek to make more fully present divine power. We've seen the fallacy which we can so easily give way to, the fallacy that invoking divine power is a way of reinforcing or bodying out human capacities for force. But the natural corollary of what's been said so far is that divine power becomes operative in particular circumstances in the world where human power is renounced. A caution here. Very often, when one human being says to another, the important thing is the renunciation of power, they frequently mean the important thing is the renunciation of your power, rather than mine. I'm not talking about a renunciation of power to one another in the world, but another kind of renunciation. Recommending surrender to some superior human force has been a deep moral shadow on much religious ethics, as any feminist analysis will tell you. But the renunciation we're talking about here is always a matter addressed to oneself. I or we are passionate to see the power of God at work in the world. What we then do is to strive to be silent enough to let it happen. Because the more noise of force and anxiety we make, then on this analysis, the less likely it will be that anything resembling the integrity of divine act will appear or be effective in our midst. Or to put it in other terms, a religious recommendation of non-violence is more than saying it is bad to be harsh to one another. It is something to do with saying, where is it that God appears effectively? If the aim of any action or policy is to allow God's power more immediate scope in a situation, if what we pray for and work for is that God will be more manifest, more visible, more involved in the transformation of a situation of suffering or crisis, then any strategy avoiding the use of coercion or violence has to be preferable. As it's sometimes been put, the believer's task in such a context is to get out of the way of divine action, emphatically not to try and channel it or exercise it on their own behalf. Some of you may know that extraordinary novel by Russell Hoban called Ridley Walker, set in a post-nuclear, post-apocalyptic Kent. Civilization has long since been buried, and the moral compass of the fragmented culture that's left is mostly provided by travelling Punch and Judy shows, operated by two curious shamanistic characters called the Prime Mincer and the Westminster. There's also a character in the book called the Ardship of Cambry, but I pass over him. Ridley Walker, the hero of the book, is growing up in a world that is morally, spiritually bewildering, where changes are already beginning to occur that are beginning to push that society yet again towards a technology of killing. Ridley Walker at one or two points has epiphanic revelations about the divine, though he hardly has the word for it. But at one point he says that the only way he can sum it up is that the onlyest power is no power, and when it comes you have to get out of the way of it. A basic spiritual principle which I think sums up much more economically than what I've been trying to argue. The believer's task is to get out of the way of the divine action, to unclutter the life, the policies, the language that we use, so that the reality of the divine appears. And there's one specific aspect of how we imagine divine power, especially in the Abrahamic traditions, which might be relevant in this connection. Right at the beginning, I said that, of course, it seems obvious that the supreme exercise of divine power is the creation and maintaining of the world. A very impressive demonstration of power, except that it isn't in the ordinary sense. But if the most obvious manifestation of divine power is the existence of the world itself, if God is the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, then divine power is most centrally and definitively characterized as the power which gives existence to what it is not, the freedom to bring what is other into life, into reality. Divine power exhibits itself in establishing what is other to it, which is, of course, radically opposite to any exercise of power which is controlling or defensive, any notion of competition or rivalry, anxiety and triumph. The divine power we're talking about is manifest in the coming into being of what is, as we see it, and that what is what is not God. So the believer ought to be someone who sees the typical case of power, divine power, as a power shown in giving life and allowing the reality of the other to be itself. God makes a world with integrity, a world in which finite things have specific laws of action, in which created reality has integrity in its own right. And if, to go back to Augustine for a moment, if there is ever such a thing as a defensible force in human affairs, perhaps there's a case for saying that it applies where there is a need to restrain the exercise of human power to deny or enslave the other. Back to Augustine's protective or reactive principle in terms of defensible force. But the fundamental point is that if we are serious about the doctrine of creation, then divine power is about the bringing to life of what is other. The doctrine of creation, unlike creation itself, doesn't happen all at once. It doesn't spring to birth ex nihilo. The doctrine of creation makes its way through various versions, discarding solutions. Because one temptingly obvious way of thinking about creation is to think of it as in Plato's Timaeus. There is an immensely sophisticated and resourceful power which imposes shape on what is shapeless. And 90% of the time, I guess that is how we think of creation as we think of human creativity, the making of something into something else. But the doctrine of creation, as Jews, Christians and Muslims have received it and refined it, is not a doctrine about making something into something else. It's a doctrine about a relationship between God and what is not God, a relationship in which what is not God exists by the sheer liberty of the act of God. So, drawing this together a little, what I'm suggesting is that a traditionally informed religious perspective on power in general, divine power in particular, should give ground for a moral and spiritual critique of human power and a positive evaluation of non-violence. Power as bound in with competition and rivalry and the endemic anxiety that goes with that is a power which, in fact, is never able to transform a situation or guarantee stability. There will always be instability, inequality bound into that. someone wins and someone loses in the exchanges of human power. And this theological perspective on divine power takes us potentially right away from that zero-sum game. It allows us to say that human flourishing is not a threat to God, and that obedience to God is not some kind of diminution of human dignity. It allows us to say that divine command or divine will is not a matter of alien force imposing something, but a matter of the being of God drawing us to echo its own liberty. That traditionally informed perspective gives us grounds also for a clear affirmation of the God-given character of difference, of otherness in the world. God makes a world not only other to himself, but constantly othering itself from itself, characterized by diversity, by polyphony, moving and changing by the answering of different elements within it. And it gives us grounds for an ascetical discipline of questioning our own concept and exercise of power more and more systematically and mercilessly. When we've named and identified some of the pathologies in thinking about power that I've hinted at in these remarks, we have some of the material we need for holding up our own plans, our own acts, our own fears and anxieties to the scrutiny of that notion of a divine power which is not the ultimately successful version of human power and human force. And to hold one's own exercise of power against that is the heart of a properly ascetical life, where the exercise of self-questioning becomes habitual and, we pray, in the long run, transformative. Transformative to the degree that it helps us to get out of the way of divine creative love. And not least, of course, all this gives us the grounds for a critical dismantling of religious anxieties about control. As you will have noticed, these anxieties have not become any less marked in the last few years, and some of the most powerful forms of resurgent religion in our world, right across the spectrum, are characterized by that desperate anxiety around control and that desperate fear of undisciplined otherness. If we understand what divine power truly is, we have no excuse for obsessions with control, however many reasons we might have for feeling anxiety around it. And it would be, I believe, a worthy project for people whose perspective was traditionally informed in the way I've outlined, to see if they could stand together on this and say, when we claim to believe in a God who is creator in this sense, we are setting our face firmly against control anxiety as the definitive form of religious integrity in our world. Like you, I'm not holding my breath for that to happen. And yet, I believe a project like this, and indeed an audience like this, ought to be contemplating what it might mean to say that that is where faith belongs in the map of our contemporary world. Faith as a place, faith as a ground from which fundamental challenges can be placed to a world of mutual anxiety, suspicion, and fear, and a world whose dominating category is so often zero-sum competition. So it's obvious that what I've been saying can't exactly be taken for granted among religious believers. Apart from the daily task of resisting fear, the daily task of resisting the reducing of belief to fear-dictated terms, the answer, if there is one, must lie in a fuller grasp of how divine power belongs, as I've hinted, with a whole grammar of talking about God's independence of the universe, not in order to consolidate a picture of God as some alien being outside the universe, nor to reduce God to a highly exceptional case of beings inside the universe, but somewhere in and among that, to understand that the act which is the universe is activated, energized by a life that is, as I say, being and willing and doing all at once, and that is where power receives its sense. And if we are in any way to become effective witnesses, I'm tempted to say apostles, of some such vision as that, we need those highly traditional disciplines of attentive silence before the mysteriousness of a life that is being and willing and doing in this way. We need a particular kind of silence to energize our witness, because it does take a certain amount of liberty, intelligence, strength, and persistence to stop talking. It's taken me, as you will have seen, quite a while to summon up anything like the liberty and intelligence or whatever to stop talking, but now I shall.
Well, thank you so very much for your lecture. There is time for questions, and we have flying mics. So if people could just indicate whether they would like to ask a question, then we could direct the microphone. Here, the first one's in the front row. So Sarah, could you just come here perhaps?
Thank you very much for coming back to Oxford. It's lovely to see you here. And thank you for that wonderful lecture. Why do you think it is that the anxious, controlling forms of faith are so resurgent? And to put a subsidiary, from within those forms of faith, I guess they feel they're being faithful, traditional and so on, but faithful particularly, I think, is the paradigm frequently used. How would you actually speak to that desire to be faithful that often seems to live out itself in an anxious and fearful way?
Thank you. That's a very large question, but a fair one. So let me offer 2 or 3 thoughts in response. First is something which I remember frequently having to discuss with, for example, people in government talking about religious diversity. A great deal of what we now see as anxious and controlling conservative faith is in many ways very deeply non-traditional. The complaint I sometimes used to make to people in government was it won't do to say that there are radical Muslims and moderate Muslims. Neither of those words tells you anything interesting. And if I were a Muslim, I'm not sure I'd be very flattered to be described as a moderate one. Fairly Muslim. Any more than I'd like to be fairly Christian. The difference is rather between an Islam in that instance which inhabits its tradition, its inherited life, confidently, and one which feels that that inherited life is so fragile that in fact a great deal of it has to be stripped away in order for it to be defensible and communicable. So there's something here, strangely, of faithlessness or unconfidence in some forms of conservative religion. Rather than inhabiting the tradition becomes something which is almost, so to speak, behind your back. You're out in the world defending it, but you never live in it. Or you choose those bits which you believe are defensible, interesting, saleable, and you push as hard as you can with those. And I think one of the greatest needs we have is inhabiting. As soon as you talk about traditionalism as opposed to tradition, you've lost the plot. Because tradition is not meant to be a cause that you fight. It is meant to be that which forms you, your home. And one of the toughest things at the moment in the religious spectrum, I think, is understanding what positively, creatively, tradition means in that framework. And I think it's one of the things that ought to be pulling us away from the anxiety you talk about. So, I think if I were engaging, and from time to time I have, with religious conservatives of one sort or another, what I might say is, look, this is not about conservative versus liberal or radical versus moderate. This is actually about whether, let's put it very bluntly, faith is about you or about God. Whether the determinant of your behavior as a person of faith is your own sense of homelessness or alienation or anxiety, or whether the determinant of your behavior as a religious person is what you actually believe to be true about God. Now, I can hear some people coming out and say, well, of course, I believe lots of things to be true about God, and they're all being attacked by liberals like you, or whatever. And that's where the conversation gets a little bit difficult. But perhaps you can see something of what I mean there. That a lot of the anxiety comes from thinking, it's about me. And I want to say, well, if God is the God we seem to be saying he is, then maybe we could inhabit the gifts he gives us with a little more confidence or a little more gratitude, which is part of the key. Sorry, I'm rambling on, but I think you see where I'm going.
Really helpful, thank you.
That's another one.
Thank you very much. Excuse me, Lord Williams. I begin rather nervously. I'm not used to having all these people behind me. I was a school teacher for many years, so I'm more used to having a few children in front of me. But I wrote a book here this afternoon to offer you. I began to think about these problems many years ago in Northern Ireland, when I found, as many British bodies found to their puzzlement, Christians were killing Christians. It wasn't portrayed in that manner. Of course, the government at the time was very anxious to declare it had nothing to do with religion at all. But it clearly did. And so, much later in my life, when I was asked by my pupils to write a book to explain to them why I taught them as I did, I taught mathematics, I came finally to the conclusion that one should leave God out of this discussion altogether. He should really be regarded as simply ineffable, and we should look at ourselves. My question, therefore, is this. I came to the conclusion that religion should simply be identified as family habits. A religion, generally speaking, religious faith, as you might say, is actually learnt by a child within a family because it is the family's religion. It is their habit. Would it not help, and I do believe, but I'd like you to tell me whether you think so, would it not help if religions were generally regarded as nothing more than habits, and leaving God out of the equation, out of this discussion altogether? Thank you.
Thank you. It's a very interesting notion. I'm tempted, and I suppose I'm now asking myself why I feel I need to resist the temptation to some extent. I suppose it's partly because I don't believe language about God is indifferent. I believe that the effort to get our language about God as adequate as we can, which is not very adequate, is a legitimate, indeed imperative thing. Just as, speaking for a moment as a poet, the labour of getting the words right, or as right as they can be, whatever that means, is a real labour and a necessary one. So I'm not sure I want just to resign any sort of claim, doctrine, systematic discourse in favour of just saying it's habit. I want a bit of capacity for language to work critically around itself in this connection as well. Many years ago, I did a refresher course for some clergy about the Eucharist, and asked the clergy there as an exercise to write together a Eucharistic prayer during the 2 or 3 days of the conference. You won't be very surprised to hear that by the third day agreement had not appeared. But the phrase that stuck with me from one of the participants, an old priest of enormous holiness and insight, who'd contributed almost nothing to the discussion, and one sensed his despair emanating. He briefly lifted his head and said, "Well, I think we should just pass around some bread and wine with an affirmative grunt." I have some sympathy with that. It's not a million miles, I think, from some of what you're saying. Which is why I've also occasionally said that I'd really like to be a Quaker when I grow up. But what I'm, I think, trying to say, not quite wanting to go down the route of just talking about habit, is that there is, as part of what I call the tradition, a talking about God, which is not simply static. It asks itself questions. It tries to get things slightly more in balance within the tradition it's in. So, in that it seeks to relate to something other than its own talking, its own self, in that it therefore makes some claims about truth, I wouldn't want to resign it just to the matter of habit. There's a lot more to be said. That's where I'd start. Thank you. I look forward to the book.
The next question is the gentleman in the blue shirt in the third row from the back.
Thank you. If God's power, if to be attentive to God's power, we have to renounce our own, and it seems that we're left with some sort of ascetic passivity, where we just kind of watch the world go by. And so my question is, what is the room for political activism or social activism in such a way that doesn't contradict what we need to kind of be attentive?
Thank you. I think every possible place, because what I'm, I think, seeking to suggest here is that our mistake in, let's say, adopting a political cause is not the adoption of a political cause, but the assumption that our adoption of it licenses us to pursue it with every means possible, to absolutize it, to approach it with the sense that the ideal solution to this would be unqualified power to impose. And back to Augustine, really. It's important, says Augustine in The City of God, to recognize, appreciate, and even work for any of those limited goods in this world which make the dignity of human beings more rather than less safe. It's absolutely legitimate. And what I'm talking about is not passivity. I'm going to do nothing, I'm going to let everybody else do things. Can't someone else do it? Which, as you may remember, was Homer Simpson's slogan for election as mayor in one episode of The Simpsons. Let someone else do it. It's not that. Getting out of the way of divine power is in itself a hugely demanding act. What Russian Christians would call a podvig, an ascetic exploit. It's not sitting back. And the process of trying to make God's action, God's reality more visible, more effective in the world, requires both that discipline of silence and self-relativizing, and those achievable, intelligible human goals that we set ourselves to honour the dignity of persons who are made in God's image. So a lot more to be said, but I don't let it be said that I'm commending passivity here. But I am, I think, putting a question mark against both an activism which absolutizes its goals and also an activism which says I must be seen to be doing something at all costs, never mind what I'm actually doing.
The gentleman in the second row from, yes. Becoming livelier.
Thank you, Dr. Williams, for your talk. When I was listening to you and listening about the idea that we do not need to keep God safe, I thought of a quote that's attributed to Emperor Tiberius, which is probably incorrectly attributed, but it's, when the issue of blasphemy came up against the gods, he responded, "No, let the gods defend their own honor." So my question to you is, can you relate your talk to the issue of blasphemy, which the Abrahamic religions have punished, often with death, both in the present and in the past?
Indeed, thank you very much. You put your finger on a really crucial point there. It's taken a lot of Christians quite a lot of time to get to the point of saying something like the Emperor Tiberius, which is a very strange proposition when you think about it. And I think that once again, the issue of blasphemy is neuralgic and painful for people, because especially in situations that are felt to be unstable, then a word spoken against my God is a word spoken against me, and if I feel vulnerable and all the rest of it, that's how I will receive it. I argued a few years ago when the discussion about the cartoons of the Prophet Muhammad in Denmark was much discussed, that it was actually not very helpful just to cast this in terms of benighted Muslims making themselves difficult. We also had to say, well, why is there such apprehension and fear in that community that the apparent rubbishing of its most sacred icons by a wider public is felt with such murderous intensity? We have to start with that question and ask some critical questions of ourselves, therefore. Equally, in very general terms, people sometimes say that the one thing you never do is burn the enemy's flag. That is part of basic human civility and respect, is the civility and respect for the icons, the signs of the sacred of other cultures and communities. And I just wish we could recast some of our discussion, not in terms of freedom of speech, but in terms of civil respect and mutuality. So I think we get a bit further forward then. But meanwhile, yes, I think it has a lot to do with the fusion of the signs of God with the signs of my security. If one is wobbly, the other's going to be wobbly. And, well, interesting, even in Christian scripture, you find that accusation against the deacon St. Stephen, that he has blasphemed God and Moses. Not only has he spoken words against God, he's spoken words against Moses, the lawgiver, and there's a fusion between that disrespect towards the human carrier of the divine word and the divine itself. So we all have a lot of painful history here. And the, I think, entirely right and proper instinct that reverence for our own sacred vocabulary and the sacred vocabulary of others is axiomatic. The fusion between that and the sense that you must then suppress anything that looks different, that's the difficult point. And I think we're nowhere near having a sensible discussion of that in a lot of the Western world at the moment. Either way around.
Right. The gentleman again, the third row from the top on the far left from me.
Thank you, Dr. Williams, for your talk. I hope I'm not incorrectly summarizing by saying that you said that divine power, as as you understand it, is it's beyond this universe. It's non-rivalrous. It's beyond competition. It seems that all faiths, Abrahamic or non-Abrahamic, deal with the conception of good and evil. And I was wondering if you could comment in this notion of divine power about, does evil exist, or is it simply a reflection of sort of human conceptions of how the world works? If God is beyond this universe, is evil within this universe and therefore never in competition with God? And should it be a thing of human concern then?
Goodness, yes, that's a complex question. Let me start by saying that I don't believe that good and evil are competitors. They're not two football teams. And again, one of our regular misapprehensions is to treat them as if they were. So when Milton's Satan says, "Evil be thou my good," we can read it as Satan saying, all things being equal, I'd rather be evil than good. But of course what Satan is saying is, the good I want, and we all want good, is this. And this is rebellion against God. So evil, in a traditional Christian perspective certainly, is misplaced desire for good. It's finding your good in the wrong place. That is, in rebellion against reality, one way or another, rebellion against the reality of God, rebellion against the reality and imperative of the dignity of the other person, but finding what you want, your goal, your good, in that distorted place. And because, without going into the huge complexities of theodicy, because God has made a world in which there are choices and there are diverse goods, and we shape our lives by decision, there remains that possibility that our decisions are guided by a misidentification of where the good is to be found. And that's evil. Augustine spends a lot of energy in his confession saying, evil's not some kind of thing or even some kind of power. It's the vacuum that sets in when we mistake basically what's good for us. What's good for us is loving reconciliation with God and one another. That's the good. That's it. And finding the final good, what we most desire and long for in other places than that, creates that vacuum into which destructively are sucked the lives of so many people. Evil's real, in that sense, absolutely real, but it's not some kind of stuff.
Yes, Brandon, the third row from below, Sarah.
Yes, thank you for your lecture. I was just wondering if you could say a little bit more about this understanding of divine power as allowing the other to exist, because within the Abrahamic traditions, there is this understanding of divine power as vulnerability, as allowing a space, as it were, for the other to exist, a space for creation. And I'm wondering if one began with that, what would an activism, an activity in the world look like?
Thank you. Yes, a very, very important connection made there between our talk about divine power and vulnerability. That's to say, defenselessness. And I think part of what I've been arguing is whatever we say about the power of God, we have to say it is defenseless in one sense, just as people talk sometimes about the poverty of God, in that God has nothing but himself to give us, which is everything, but he's got nothing else. And we can therefore say that, yes, poverty in a sense, defenselessness in a sense, absolutely. And with that, of course, goes the sort of pictorial or mythological language of God, as it were, withdrawing so that there may be what is not God. And there are all kinds of logical difficulties and theological difficulties with that, but one sees what it's saying. So on that basis, what does divine action in the world look like? I suppose I can only think of it myself in terms of what happens when there are moments in the world's fabric where there is sufficient generous withdrawal of human aspiration and selfishness, simply to let the reality of God be. And when that reality is, then because it is being, willing and doing all at once, something happens. That's how I make sense myself of miracle. Something happens in the world which allows the presence of God to be more intense, and because God's presence is never just something lying around, but always something active, you never quite know what might happen. It's not terribly philosophically sophisticated, but I think that's where I'd start thinking about miracle and divine action.
Yes, the next question is here. Exactly, the lady here.
Thank you very much. Can I ask you a very naive question? You said that language about God is not indifferent.
Mm-hmm.
You said that we should not scale down God.
Mm.
Why do you call him he?
Family habit, I suppose. No, it's completely a serious question, and I don't quite know how to get that right, because I've never myself found an alternative that comes easily, which tells you something, no doubt, about me, as it tells you something about the church itself. So that's a confession of what I am used to saying, haven't yet stopped myself being used to saying, try from time to time to prevent myself saying or to circumvent, but haven't really successfully managed. And I think we are in a transitional period at the moment as to how we talk about God. Sometimes it sounds, to my ears, I say no more, laboured and artificial to say God rather than a personal pronoun every time. Sometimes it sounds as if I'm making the wrong kind of laboured point by saying she rather than he. So I can only share a certain puzzlement as to how we handle this there, but you're right to identify it.
There is a question in the last row, in the back row.
Does the talk about us getting out of the way of divine power, undermining the divine power?
Would you like to say a bit more about that? That's an interesting thought.
Just the suggestion that if we have an all-powerful God,
Hmm.
then in a sense, how do our actions actually have any bearing on what he or she can do?
Because God has made a world in which there are real agents, like you and me, God has, again, this is unsatisfactory language, but bear with me, God has, so to speak, elected that there be agents other than God's self. Which means that what we do, or don't do, God has so ordained that divine power becomes more or less visible because in and of, through what we do and don't do. So I don't think it's a matter of, as it were, weakening God's power by saying that we, so to speak, have the ability to make God more or less visible, because God can always override that. Because if I'm right, then divine power is not about overriding anyway. If God's made a world in which we have real agency and choice, then I think that's one of the consequences, that God does not override. His power is not shown simply in that driving through of divine purpose at all costs.
Yes, perhaps the gentleman in the, I don't know, fifth row from, yes, at the far end of this block. That's the, should we do it? No, we have plenty of time. Be happy to draw to a conclusion.
Yes, thank you. If it's true, as you say, and I agree, that God has made a world in which there are real agents who are real causes, would it not be a little better to say that created power is a participation in divine power, and that when human beings act in the world, they are indeed, in some sense, channeling divine power. You in your even in your sacramental role as priest and bishop, channel divine power in a special way. So would it not be a little better to talk about how human power participates, a good medieval notion, participates in divine power?
Thank you. A good medieval notion, and one that I have a lot of sympathy with. I think what you've done is to identify a slight Manichaean streak in what I've been saying, in rhetorically overdoing the contrast between divine power and the power we normally talk about. I don't apologize for that, because I think it has to be done. But, of course, at two levels, what you say is absolutely true. Level one is that whatever we do, say, and are is because in some degree it participates in the agency that sustains everything. Again, in scholastic terms, there is a level of participation in divine action just in virtue of being created. But the further level is that, of course, yes, our acts, our policies, our decisions may be more or less transparent or communicative of, transparent to or communicative of the divine action, depending on the level at which grace is active in us. I don't dispute that for a moment. I would still want to say, I think, that something of the breakthrough into understanding how grace works has to be a very rigorous questioning of what we normally mean by power and agency and creativity, so as to prevent us, as I say, simply thinking in the wrong way of a neat analogical assent from us being not very powerful to God being really very powerful indeed. So I'd grant, I think, a lot of the substance of what you're saying.
Yes, perhaps the lady in the back row. Just a second.
Sorry, this could take a while. Talk among yourselves.
No, in the back
row.
Back row. Gives a break.
Thanks very much. I wonder if you might reflect a bit, just out loud, about what does the process of getting out of the way of God's action require cognition, or kind of is it an intentional process? And does it require a belief in our relationship with God, or can it happen in the absence of that?
That's most interesting, especially the last bit of the question. I'd say that getting out of the way of God, and that is a shorthand when all's said and done, getting out of the way of God is what happens when our habitual sort of hamster on the wheel mental habits are stilled or silenced for long enough for us to be moving into a somewhat different state of awareness, by which I don't mean mystical experience, whatever that is, but a different level of self-awareness and world awareness. This is historically generated, sustained, encouraged, and occasionally frustrated by traditional religious practice. But of course there are instances, why shouldn't there be, where something triggers or generates in a person a level of more liberated awareness, in which there is, whether they know it or not, some kind of alignment with the act of God. So getting out of the way may be, for some people, almost unself-conscious. For most ordinary religious mortals, it requires a certain amount of prayer, fasting, and getting up early in the morning, that sort of thing.
We have time for one last question. I think with the lady in the middle. Yes, there.
The lady in the middle.
The lady in the middle.
It's a nice title to go back with.
Thank you. I was very interested to hear how you see this particular framing and understanding of God as relaxing the anxiety of control that feels the need to defend God. It seems to me that a lot of anxiety of control also has to do with not simply defending God, but also a very strong sense that there is sort of fallen brokenness in the world that causes people suffering and harm. And it seems that this understanding of, I'm not sure, I would be interested to hear you say how what you presented would speak to anxiety and control that is about wanting to prevent certain types of harm and suffering, because it seems that that would still persist even with sort of God being more, self-sustaining in this.
Yeah. Thank you. That's a really penetrating thought. First point, when confronted with horrific suffering, whether of an individual or a community, when sitting by the deathbed of somebody you love, when simply confronted with the overwhelming suffering of Syria or a Haiti or Philippines, what do we feel? We like to think we feel compassion, or we hope we feel compassion. And at the same time, at least speaking for myself, 9 times out of 10, we also feel a deep frustration. I ought to be able to stop this. And that entirely understandable human reaction is one of the things I think we have to keep an eye on. I ought to be able to stop this? Just a moment. I am responsible here, but I'm not responsible in that way. It is not up to me, solo, to solve this. It is up to me to respond appropriately. So that's the first point. And I do think sometimes we can get ourselves into a real kind of moral and spiritual panic. Why can't I make this better? And isn't that the most awful thing of being alongside somebody in intense suffering? I ought to be able to make this better. Why can't I make this better? What's wrong with me? Anxiety, as you say. This is out of control. And that's horrible. But it's, it is very real. Second thing to say is that, obvious point again, there is no theology that removes the sting of suffering. There is no theology that takes away pain. And when people in pain or angry about the pain of others ask for theological responses, I'm not at all sure they'd be any happier if I made a completely conclusive and watertight theological case to them. What they want or need is God. And therefore, we're back to the question, how does my act, my silence, my service, my love, my compassion, my almsgiving, my taking the next plane to the Philippines, how does that allow God to be there for the person in suffering? So again, not a passive or a resigned attitude, but I think one that keeps a little bit of an eye on that slightly feverish, slightly dramatic element in us which so readily says, I ought to be able to solve this, why can't I? Because we're then back again to the power and control business, and it can sometimes lead, as I hinted a moment ago, to doing something for the sake of doing it. Look at international politics. What can we do for Syria? I wish I knew. I could talk about that for a long time. But the one thing that I think is risky to do, and the one thing which I think, to their great credit, the British Parliament drew back from last year, The one thing that's dangerous to do is to do something so that you feel you're doing something. And to think, well, because I'm doing something, it ought to be getting better. And you then get very angry because it's not getting better. And the whole sort of tangle recreates itself. So, sorry, it's a massive and very important area, but that's a beginning of a reply.
I'm sure there must be many more questions, but I'm afraid our time for this lecture has come to an end. The good news, of course, is that Rowan Williams will be back. In fact, later this afternoon at 5, there is going to be another event in this series which has him in conversation with John Snow, and then there will be a second lecture next Wednesday at 5. So the conversation, I think, on this topic, on the topic of faith and power, will be continued. For the moment, all that remains for me is to ask you all to join me in again thanking Dr. Williams for his